Chapter 15, 1865 and after. We're going to go back and pick up basically the last part of Chapter 14 before we really get into 15. But to give you a little bit of an introduction, the war was terrible. Deaths and destruction everywhere, primarily in the South, yes, but there was some in the North. In the South, it was the land, but altogether, over 600,000 Americans were killed. 600,000 Americans killed by other Americans. And if that doesn't make you absolutely sick at your stomach, I don't know what would. But if you use a percentage of the population of the 600,000 killed, in today's terms, it would be more than 5 million. That's something to think about. Of course, property was destroyed. And I think the most important and serious thing that happened was the psyche. It was either totally destroyed or messed up because you were fighting against relatives, people you knew, people who'd been around all their lives, all your life. It was truly a brother's war. And the questions of what exactly did the future hold for you? Of course, some of the questions are, should things stay the same? Should Kentucky move into the future? What is this freedom for the newly freed blacks? What is it going to encompass? So what exactly does freedom mean? Does it mean to the freedom and ability to move around, to not have to work so hard, to have the same rights as the white man did? Questions and questions, and no real good answers at this time. Meanwhile, white people ruled the state of Kentucky, when slavery here had been not so much an economic, rather it was a social and racial controlling thing. Yes, there was money in it because we were a slave-selling state, but it was still social. And violence, of course, during this time is covered a great deal more in Chapter 16 and 17. But what about the economic aspects of the war? Yes, we know wars cost money, but I'm not talking about from the political point of view. I'm talking about Kentucky's point of view, from a personal point of view. Of course, there was property laws, and as we've discussed, one of the ways you determined your worth and was in the amount of slaves that you owned. I mean, you could have thousands of acres of land, but the land wasn't any good if you didn't have the people to work it. And even if you didn't have land, if you had slaves, you had property. You could sell your slaves, you could hawk your slaves, you could use them as collateral. You could always have money if you had slaves. So the slaves was a property. And after the war, we had lost over $100 million in slaves. Farm workers, both black and white, either dead, gone, or just not working. And of course, with no workers, no planting. So the acres that were under cultivation fell. Over 4 million acres fell. I mean, the acres didn't fall, of course, but there was less than 4 million less harvested. Hemp production fell 80%. Tobacco production fell 57%. And of course, with all the products not being produced, the prices that the farmers were getting for what they were actually manufacturing and growing, it fell. Livestock, our beautiful Kentucky horses, more than 100,000 of them gone. Mules, which we needed for work, 45,000 gone. And cattle, 170,000 head of cattle gone. And a lot of it was gone because the Union Army had been in your area and had requisitioned things. And of course, I put quotations around the word requisition, which simply means they took it because they needed it and with a promise to pay later, maybe. And if you were loyal to the Union, you stood a chance of maybe being reimbursed after the war. But if you had been loyal to the South and something was requisitioned from your farm, then you were not going to get any money back. And as prices are falling for what you are selling, prices for what you are buying are coming up. And of course, everyone suffered during the war. Well, there really weren't any jobs to be had. With no jobs, there was no income. And with no income, well, not good. During that brief year of neutrality, of course, trade, especially along the Ohio corridor, did boom. But once it begins, and our neutrality is over with, I hope you found that great hog swindle of 1864 a little bit amusing. In an effort to save the government money, they were going to cut out the middleman on these hog sales. And they did save the government over $200,000, but it cost the farmer who was growing the pigs for sale over $300,000, so of course it didn't last very long. But of course our General Burbridge was blamed along with everything else. And trade began to slow because although we were still shipping merchandise to the South, our boats would return empty because everything was not being allowed to ship back out of the South. They needed everything they got to go overseas to raise money for their war material. Industry, we'd never had a lot, but the two biggest items, of course, were manufacture of whiskey and all types of tobacco products. And I thought it was quite interesting, as pointed out in your text, that even though the Confederates had invaded our state, the one thing they did not do was do anything to bother the manufacture of whiskey and tobacco. Meanwhile, the biggest city on the river, of course, Louisville, did grow because of commerce, and our state's financial situation did improve. So while all this is going on, what about social and cultural? Well, number one, progress in public education stopped. It had just started to get going good in 1849 and 50, and it just kind of stopped because teachers were either in the military or they'd have to take better paying jobs. Meanwhile, school buildings and colleges were requisitioned as hospitals or places for troops to live. But when troops were in a community, and that was usually 99% of the time Union, there would be parties and picnics and dances and plays and band concerts and, of course, flirtations and quick weddings, as in all wars. But the county fairs were discontinued out of, I guess you would say, respect. And women had to take men's jobs because the men were away. Jobs that women had not been qualified for before, but now all of a sudden, with nobody else around to do them, we're running the plantations, we're running the business, we're doing the men's work. And if you didn't do that, you knitted socks and sweaters for the troops. Women were also very busy, much as in the Revolutionary War, raising funds for the soldiers' families, because they didn't get much pay when they did get paid. And originally, the men folk in charge of everything thought that women were too delicate to be involved in nursing because there was a lot of pain and blood and suffering. And I guess they just didn't realize what a woman went through when she had a baby. There would be pain and suffering and blood. But due to lack of manpower and having to take the man to put him on the front lines, they finally let women do nursing. And I don't think I know it's not in the textbook, but one of the things I found interesting was that, and I know this sounds sexist, and I don't mean it to be, but women, especially women of this era, we had what I call a clean gene. Now, one of the things that we could do, we didn't know about medical things, how to set bones per se, or, how to give medications, but we did know how to take care of our menfolk. And one of the first things a woman would do when she was called on to nursing was to go into the wards and change the sheets and make sure that the patient had clean sheets. She would give him baths. She would shave him. She would do everything she could to make him clean and comfortable. That's one of the few things she did know how to do, and she did it well. And it was noticed that in certain wards where women were nursing, that the men were living longer. And finally figured we didn't know anything about germs and things like that. It was just a womanly thing we did, and it happened to be a good thing to do to keep the patients clean. But in other wards, like the amputee wards, women did the same thing. Unfortunately, more patients were dying. And they finally figured out that one of the things that women did when they would, clean the bed and clean their patient and shave them and things, they were going to wherever they had been amputated, and they would take those little things that were eating the dead flesh off. And those maggots and things were good because they were eating the dead flesh, and that kept gangrene from setting in. So inadvertently, where there was no amputations, patients were living longer because of the female nurses. And in areas where they had the amputation, the patients were dying because the women were keeping them too clean. It's like in any war. In any war, you discover new things. Like in World War II, we're going to discover penicillin. But women were finally called on to do another manly job, and once a woman touches any type of work a man has done, it becomes woman's work. And it's only been the last few years that we're able to see men in the nursing profession again. And I'm very proud to announce that we have several men in the nursing program here on the community college. But the changes that came about, of course, war ended slavery. There was no doubt about that. It also decided the limits on a state's ability to defy the federal government. In other words, states' rights were secondary to the federal government. But even before the war began, by 1860, Kentucky seemed to be stagnating. More people are leaving than arriving. An attempt at manufacturing had pretty much failed. And there weren't any works of art or music or literature coming out of Kentucky from Kentuckians. And of course, we had that crazy, chaotic land system. So all that combined, and then you put in it a lack of educational advances for those who did want to go, it did not bode well for our citizens. And of course, all of our great politicians had died. Clay had died. Breckenridge was no longer around. The ones who had helped us so much in the past were gone. Questions and questions and questions and questions and questions. What kind of questions? What's going to happen? What's going to go on? We don't know. We don't know. So now we're back into chapter 15. Questions. Continuity and change. Now, I know this seems like what kind of a list is this, Miss Grace? What do you put up here? Something that is so obvious. Well, it needs to be pointed out. Rural Kentuckians, urban Kentuckians, and they're as different as night and day. You've got rich and poor and young and old and black and white. You've got Eastern Kentucky, Central Kentucky, and Western Kentucky, and all of these create different classes and different ethnicity. And the sad thing was, there's no unity within these groups. Some rich wanted to go forward in the future. Some rich wanted to stay the way the things were. Some poor and black wanted to go forward. Some poor and black wanted to stay the way the things are. There just was no consensus. But some of the things, most Kentuckians traveled very little. Well, we didn't have cars. You either used your feet or you used a horse or a mule. But you usually stayed pretty close to wherever you were born. And over 1/4 of Kentuckians were illiterate and depended upon oral traditions. Now, I hope you read on page 219 those accounts of witches, where we had one in Owen County in 1869 who was actually arrested and presented to the grand jury, although she was not indicted for being a witch. And then there is a story of supposedly, and I think you picked up on the word, a woman was supposedly burned as a witch. Did it really happen? Well, according to oral tradition, it did. Because the fear of the unknown, especially in the eastern part of the state, well, like, for instance, even today, and I'll admit to being a member of this myself, if I go into a totally dark room and close the door and there's no light on, and you hear a sound, if you don't recognize what that sound is immediately, you imagine all kinds of things. Is it a ghost? Is it a dog? Is it someone in there to attack you? You don't know. And we're educated. So you can only imagine that people who are uneducated and don't understand things, they make up things and they're frightened. Yet there were some Kentuckians who traveled. There were some who were very educated. And some had visions of the future, but admittedly these were the minority. So you ask yourself, what exactly is a typical Kentuckian? I don't think you can come up with a scenario. It would depend on what area of the state you were in, what socioeconomic area you were studying. Each of us are unique. But whether you were a typical Kentuckian or not, you resisted change. And I also have to admit to that. I embrace change as long as change enhances or makes my life easier. But when it makes my life more difficult, I resist, even in the 21st century. Our population is also declining. Immigrants, we don't have many immigrants in our state. 1 in 20, yes, were foreign born. But in Louisville, 20% of the population was foreign and predominantly Irish and German. And they even had their own newspapers. There was very little of any immigration in from other states. So Kentucky had become almost self-contained. And I think according to the census, over 90% of the population was actually born in the state. So what is family life like? Now, I'm sorry, folks. I know when I was your age, I used to hate people saying, I remember when, or when I was young. But this particular section brought back many a memory. I was born here in Kentucky in Owensboro. And I spent the first dozen years of my life here before we left the state. I lived in the city of Owensboro, where we had public schools. I rode a city bus to go to school. As a matter of fact, we just lived 1 block from Settle Memorial Church out there on 4th Street. And at that time, that was where the really hoity-toity went to church. And one of our good Sunday afternoon or Sunday morning activities was sitting on our front porch and watching these people really dressed in the nines going to church and watching them climb those steps and thinking, oh, I wish that I was of the social class I could go. Even though we weren't Methodists, it still would have been nice to be decked out in my Sunday best and walk up those steps. It just seemed so luxurious. We had activities, we had parks, we had running water, we had electricity. But then on the other side of that coin is my father returned to his roots in a little place called Geneva, Kentucky. He was going to farm. And we only had 50 acres. And we raised chickens and pigs. excuse me, hogs. And we grew corn and we grew soybeans. When we first went to the farm, we did not have electricity, running water, or sewer. Over the next year and a half, we did get electricity and finally got running water. But I remember having to fight the chickens to get to the outhouse. I remember having to go to bed because it was dark. I remember the kerosene lanterns. I remember Mother heating water on a stove on Saturday night, very patiently, bucketful by bucketful, and putting it in a big old aluminum tub so we could take a bath and wash our hair to be ready for church on Sunday. And I vividly remember it was always the person who was the cleanest who got to take the first bath because we all used the same bath water. And I couldn't wait till I got old enough and big enough and moved far enough away that I would be the first one to take a bath because I was always the last. I was a dirty little kid. But this is all just like bringing back memories. Your life was ruled by the seasons and weather. And it wasn't until the 1940s a lot of people even had electricity. And this was even later than the 40s. This was in the late 40s and early 50s. Your homes, of course, were uninsulated, and you would have we had a big old coal-burning pot-bellied stove. My grandmother had the fireplace. And the feather beds. Oh, yes, I remember the feather beds. They were so great. And they were actually made out of feathers. Duck feathers and chicken feathers. And you'd snuggle up in those things, and as long as you didn't have a sister or somebody who had an accident and get the bed wet, and the feathers would get wet, and they would stink. Oh, boy, big time. But the feather beds were a very good memory, and I can remember vividly, since we didn't have air conditioning or fans, you always pushed your bed over next to the window for the breezes in the summertime. And I remember laying in that feather bed with the window open and a light breeze blowing in the smell of honeysuckle growing on the fence line just outside the bedroom window. Of course, we grew our own food. If we didn't grow it, we didn't eat it. The guys would usually go hunting or fishing, although my father didn't. He wouldn't be caught dead fishing. And you had your own fruit trees, and you had beehives. In other words, if you didn't grow it, you didn't eat it, unless it was coffee, flour, sugar. Because you made your own lard from rendering the hog, and everything else you made or canned yourself. And there was also a very clear division of work. There were certain things men did and certain things that women did, which is nothing unusual at this time of the life. And of course, the church and country store were the two main social places. You went to church on a Sunday, and when you had a revival, of course, you went to church. Sometimes they had Wednesday night services, but not always because of the distance, and you were busy, especially in the summer. The country store was the meeting place. And here again, in the little town of Geneva, they had two country stores. They were in competition. And, I mean, you could get everything from thread to chicken feed to horseshoes for your horses, one big old gas pump out front, where you went to get your gas for your tractor. It was, and there was a big old pot-bellied stove in the back, and there would be little, what we call nail barrels that had been emptied that they used to sit around and talk. And I used to love to go in there because the smells. I mean, you could smell the cheeses, and it was just a great smell, like going into a delicatessen. And you get to sneak back in the back and listen to the old folks talk. And they were talking about they remembered when back and all this and all that something had happened, or the price of beans going up, or, it was just crazy. They were central to your social activity. They were necessary because that's where you got your supplies. And of course, nobody had any money except when the crops came in, so everybody had a big old charge account. And they would not let children charge for any reason. I tried that one time, and they told me no in a heartbeat. But on court days at the county courthouse, they became very important because you come to town to find out who's doing what and who's suing who. So we were modernizing a little bit here in western Kentucky in the late 40s and early 50s, but eastern Kentucky was very slow to modernize. And Lexington was thought to be the typical Kentucky by people who did not live in Kentucky. But it's going to be Louisville who's going to be the biggest and really the most typical. In 1900, 1 in 5 lived in towns no larger than 2,500. That was a big town. And the dress, didn't you pick up on how the guys wouldn't even wear underclothes in the summertime? And we had 2 pairs of shoes, one for church and one for school. And I remember going barefoot in the summertime because we couldn't afford to buy another pair of shoes. And when you get ready to go to school again in the fall, which that time was always the first Monday after Labor Day, you'd have a new pair of shoes if you were lucky. And your feet, of course, after going barefooted all summer long, they were kind of spread out, and your shoes hurt. and you didn't dare get those shoes dirty because you had to make them last all year long. And then if you had a younger sister or brother, of course the shoes would be passed down to them. So being the oldest, I had the good fortune that I usually got the new shoes. But let's take a look at Louisville for just a few minutes. 1900, they had over 200,000 in population, and folks, that's a lot of people. It was 5 times larger than any other Kentucky city. And it points out in your text how everything that happened in Louisville made news. Whether it was a scandal, somebody getting arrested, you learned about it. Whereas in a larger town in another part of the country, you probably wouldn't have heard about it. And I love that. The souvenir sporting guide, I thought was so funny. A magazine basically pointing out where you could find the houses of ill repute, if you would. But Louisville was very prosperous. It had white people, it had blacks, it had a lot of foreign immigrants. It had several public schools, it had restaurants, there was plenty of jobs. But of course, being on the river, and we know that Louisville was basically two cities, the riverfront as well as the sedate, sophisticated Louisville, there was vice. But the irony was that one sentence, when you lived in Louisville, you depended on others for livelihood, which means you didn't grow your own food to eat. Very few had their own stores. I mean, yes, there was people that owned their own stores, but for the most part of the 200,000, I mean, you're going to have, what, 5,000 that have businesses. The rest of them are working for other people. So you're depending on others for your livelihood as well as your nutrition. So what do you do for entertainment back in those days? Well, for the most part, you found your own. You played musical instruments like the piano, the guitar, the banjo, the dulcimer. I vividly remember on Sunday nights, after a big Sunday dinner, we'd get together in front of the fireplace at my grandmother's house, who lived in Geneva. The only light we had was kerosene light in the fireplace, and my grandmother played the piano or the accordion, whichever one suited her. And we had a banjo player, an uncle, and we had a guitar player. And my mother didn't have much musical talent to play, but she played something called the spoons, where you take 2 tablespoons and put them back to back and clack them. She did a pretty good job. And we'd sing. Sometimes you'd read if it was during the daytime, or you'd play board games. And there again, in Geneva, Kentucky, since the school had very little money, and I wasn't going to school in Geneva. I did go to school in Geneva. I was went to one of the last one-room schoolhouses in Geneva. And when they closed that up, made it a community center, I went to the big town of Smith Mills. And we had a very innovative teacher there. She taught us how to play board games by instead of using checkers, we used pieces of corn. And we'd take a piece of paper or an old scrap board and draw on it for the squares. We'd make our own games, our own board games. But the most typical of the leisure activities was when you go visit somebody and you just sit and talk, drink lemonade or whatever. Of course, the guys would hunt and fish. And there was always those lovely picnics in the summertime and a hayride in the fall. Now, the word Chautauqua is basically the name for a group that would come around all through the state. And for about 2 weeks, they'd be there, and you'd have meetings, and you'd have seminars, and you'd learn how to do things, and it was just kind of an entertainment thing that came to town. Now, here in Owensboro, we have, of course, Chautauqua Park. And my mother used to tell me stories of when she was a young girl back in the 20s, that she looked forward to the people coming down through the Chautauqua program from New York and putting on plays. And they introduced her to Shakespeare and things like that, and she thought it was absolutely great. Although at Chautauqua Park now, I think they have the races for the, what is it, where they have those little big cars that the kids race and the scouts? The Derby. But Chautauqua Park is a very nice park if you learn how to spell it and say it. Of course, there was always the circuses and the carnivals and the county fairs. And something maybe you were unaware of until you read about it. We had springs and spas here in our state, but these were more for the upper rich, the middle class, the upper middle class, and you had to travel. And of course, travel wasn't something most of us did. But if you were lucky, the big house cities like Louisville and Lacey and Frankfort, they had what they call opera houses. And it was basically like the little theater places where you would go and hear people sing and dance, and they put on plays. Now, minstrel shows were more like vaudeville. They were usually included white men dressing their face up in black paint and pretending to be black and singing spirituals. Of course, the South loved this. But sports, I mean, we went swimming in Ohio River. We'd ride our bikes. We'd skate with these old metal skates that you put on the bottom of your shoes. Bicycling, tennis. Tennis was more for the upper class. This much like golf is for the upper class. Croquet was a very widely popular game if you happened to live on a place that had big enough yard to do it. And as a matter of fact, I think it was when was it? I think it was 1978 or 1982, somewhere along in there. We had the world's champion croquet players in Kentucky. Of course, football was popular and baseball was popular, but basketball didn't become popular until the 1920s. But after the war, of course, activities are going to change. And they change a lot of times because, as I said, you've got so much destruction. And if you don't have a father or a brother, it's kind of hard to get together and have fun. But still most, and I'm quoting from your text, most Kentuckians, quote, worked and lived in already long established patterns. Lives changed a little. But change is just over the horizon. You're coming into the 20th century. You're coming into the 1920s. And things are going to change. Yeah, I don't know about all of you, but basically this chapter has been a trip down memory lane for me. And I waxed nostalgic here for a bit for you. I'm sorry. Like I said, I lived on a farm as well as in the big city of Owensboro when I was young. So I saw movie houses and outhouses. So most of you should count your blessings, no matter how angry you get at things, but you live in the 21st century. You've got modern technology. You've got laptop computers. You've got cell phones. You've got color television. You've got cars that start. You can even go out there and punch a button on your keychain and your car will start itself. So technology is wonderful. As I said, it makes my life easier. I'm all for it. So you're now ready for Chapter 16 and some social problems during the time frame called Reconstruction and Violence. I personally think that this chapter is out of context. I mean, to me, it was an interesting chapter, but all this about what's going on in life in Kentucky, I think it would have fitted better after we finished the violence after the Civil War, or been used before we defended the slavery. But being I'm not as smart as our text author, so we will go with the flow. And as I said, you're now ready for Chapter 16, and I won't wax nostalgic in that chapter, I promise you.